She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. Forgot a crow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cock a crow, dog a bark, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Cock a crow, dog a bark, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country.
You know, one of the sweet things I like about this song is come and tell, come and tell, come and listen, come and understand what's happening about the sweet stories in the country. Not only do we talk about the sweet stories in the country, we talk about the stories in the country, meaning the country of Guyana, not just the countryside, but the sweet stories, and we talk about the not so sweet stories. Good night to all of you. Good night to President David Arthur Granger. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing good. We're still in the rainy season, but things are going along quietly in Guyana under this PVP administration, and we hope that the Anansi Web Education could enlighten the nation and enlighten new generations to understand what happened in the past so they can make the future better. And I'm very happy to be on this program once again, and I'm very happy that the program continues to educate the present generation to understand what took place 60 years ago. It's not a historical program. It's all about the future. So I'm doing fine, and I'm enjoying this program immensely.
And I'm glad that you reminded all of us that this is about the future. This program is about the future of Guyana, and we're walking you through things some of you may have forgotten, some of you may not have even heard of those things, but that's the reason for this show. That's the purpose. And so today we want to, again, let's welcome all of you, whether you're in Guyana, outside of Guyana, wherever you are, whatever the situation is with you. We want to wish you all the best, though, on this beautiful, beautiful evening. Now, let's go into today's topic. We want to deal with the hurricane of protest to remind you guys as to what the PPP was up to then, and you'll understand what they're up to now. So we'll deal with the East Demerara villagers who became victims of the People's Progressive Party, their terrorist campaign, the hurricane of protest, and the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union, known as GAU, their violent strike from February to July 1964, despite not being involved in the sugar industry. Just imagine that, huh? Terrorists assaulted and murdered unarmed and unprotected persons who could not defend themselves. PPP terrorists did that. East Demerara villages commemorate this year the 60th anniversary of the murders of victims from their villages during the PPP GAU terrorist campaign in 1964. Today we'll discuss that. And on this program, Anansi Web Education, the East Demerara murders, 1964, that's what we're discussing tonight. The program addresses the following questions. And the first question, President Granger, what were the causes of the murders in East Demerara during the PPP GAU's terrorist campaign in 1964?
Thanks for that question, Mark. You're emphasizing particularly East Demerara, which means that there was a shift from West Demerara where the violence broke out because the strike actually started at Leonora. And today we're looking, well, of course, Leonora is West Demerara, and we're looking at East Demerara. Why did it cross water? Um, well, there were murders in East Demerara because it, it, it suggested, I think, that by a certain stage of the terrorism, the violence in West Demerara had been contained and it was not achieving the purpose. And what was the purpose? The purpose was to make the country ungovernable, the colony ungovernable. The purpose was to prevent the introduction of the proportional representation system of elections. The purpose was to prevent the British government from conducting elections in 1964. The purpose was to prevent the British government from removing the PPP from office in the event that it lost the election. And I would say the purpose was to pretend to the international community that the PPP was actually fighting a war of national liberation. It was an anti-colonial struggle, an anti-British struggle, an anti-capitalist struggle, because the PPP was regarded within the communist bloc in the mid-1960s as being revolutionary or progressive. As you know, it was quite recent that they stopped calling themselves a Leninist party. So they had some support among the communist bloc countries, and at that time we were a colony. And some people actually thought that the British were preventing Guyana from becoming independent. This is a story that PPP provided, and that the struggle, the armed struggle they were engaged in, was an anti-British struggle, and the murders and the weapons and the cash that they were receiving, the scholarships, the training of activists in communist countries, all of these things they had to justify. So the answer to your question, or the causes of the murders, is that murder was a means of making the colony ungovernable. And they used murder to demonstrate to the British, to the Guyanese residents, and to the international community that these actions were necessary to liberate Guyana from British colonialism. It was all false. The murders were simply being carried out to prevent elections from being held and to make the country ungovernable. And unfortunately, scores of Guyanese died and suffered, lost their homes, were displaced because of this campaign of terror in which the British, the PPP, tried to prevent elections from being held in December 1964. That's what it's all about. Those were the causes of the murders. That's why people were being killed. And it may seem strange now that people are being killed simply because of their political beliefs, and some of them were innocent. These are ordinary farmers, schoolboys. It's happened in the case of Godfrey Teixeira, a schoolboy coming from Sacred Heart School, 4:30 on a Monday afternoon, and a bomb is thrown into the school bus. So he was not a terrorist, he was not an activist, but people were afraid, and of course, it prompted a lot of people like that to migrate from Guyana because they didn't want to live in a country where their children were being attacked by PPP terrorists. That is what was happening. So the causes of the murders were really, they were not, I wouldn't say they were a result of anger by the PPP because they were well planned. People had to be trained, sent overseas to be trained. Weapons had to be brought, in ships from overseas. The movement away from West Demerara to East Demerara had to be devised by some mastermind in the PPP. So you can see that the whole thing was put together. The whole campaign was put together long before January 1964. It was put together since 1963 that the PPP was going to seize this country if any attempt was made to legitimately remove them by elections by the British government. So that is what was happening, and that was the reason for the murders in East Demerara, and that was responsible for the shift from West Demerara to East Demerara in 1964.
As we shift, and thank you so much for that, President Granger, we shift, we dealt with prior to this program, the West Demerara, and of course the hurricane of protest. If you're now joining us, we're reminding you guys as to what the PPP did in terms of targeting innocent citizens and murdering them during the what is called the hurricane of protests, where they deliberately murdered people. And then we just got to remind you guys that the PPP then, and we're seeing signs of that, is basically a terrorist party. The first question dealt with the causes of the murders in East Demerara. We oftentimes deal with the causes. President Granger mentioned the fact that a Godfrey Teixeira was murdered after his school bus was bombed, or the school was bombed. We saw in the 2020 post-elections protests in PPP-dominated areas up on the West Coast Berbice, where school bus was stoned and damaged, and we're seeing signs of the very things that occurred in the 60s, and particularly in 1964, 63, 64, the hurricane protest. And now to a second question. Those of you who are now joining us, this is Anansi Web Education. With me, host Granger, President David Otto Granger. Our second question tonight is, who were the victims? And you know, President Granger, we oftentimes deal with this particular question, the victims. And with the East Demerara murders by the PPP, the terrorist PPP, we want to know tonight again, who were the victims in the East Demerara villages during the PPP Gao terrorist campaign, PPP Gao's terrorist campaign in 1964. The victims, who were they?
Mark, the answer is not easy because I think at present, present day people will find it hard to understand what could be gained by murdering an aging couple at the back dam, in Bucks and Friendship, eating their MetMG lunch. All they have there is forks and shovels. They weren't attacking anyone. They were alone. They went to reap produce for the market, the weekend market. What could be gained by attacking or killing a 12 or 13-year-old schoolboy in a school bus? What could be gained by attacking a young boy, in a pasture, herding, sheep, his father's sheep? And so you can see these were innocent persons. These were not terrorists. The victims were innocent persons who were perhaps unprotected. And maybe because they were unprotected, because they couldn't defend themselves, it made more people afraid. And this is one of the purposes of the terror, to make people afraid. And it did succeed because after that, most villages in the East Coast, people ate what they grew. They grew provisions in the back dam, and that's what they ate. So if they couldn't go to the back dam, they couldn't get the food. So it was a necessity. And after that, they started traveling in groups because terrorists would just stay on the banks of the canal or the river banks and just, ambush them and pick them off if they were isolated, or solitary, people going to the back dam, as you saw in your introductory thing, with his bag on his shoulders, or grandma going to the back dam with her grandson. That was how people lived. And it made life very unpredictable and very uncertain. So the answer to your question is, the victims were usually innocent, unprotected persons who seemed to be harmless, and because they were apparently harmless, it sent shockwaves through the community. And this is what happened with the Sealies. And you can see like the whole village, turned out when the bodies were brought in their balahus. And these balahus are little flat bottom boats, for carrying pumpkins and planting and cassava and so on. They're very unsophisticated. These are poor people. So you could imagine what was the thinking of the scores of villagers who came to see these bodies brought from the back dam to the front lands. So I would say that this was the real purpose of terror. They didn't attack politicians, they didn't attack rich people, they didn't attack the British Army, they didn't attack the persons in authority, but they attacked, ordinary, innocent, poor people. And that's what made the campaign of terrorism all the more scary, because people realize anybody could, if the Sealy's could be attacked, if Godfrey Teixeira could be attacked, anybody could be killed. It really made life in the country very, very uncertain. Many people in Georgetown didn't know what was taking place on the West Demerara or the East Demerara. They just saw a little thing out in front of their windows, and they saw some boys beating up some other boys or something like that. But that wasn't the story. The story was really in the countryside. That's where people were being bombed and murdered and mutilated. So those were the victims. It could be shown that in most of the villages that were attacked, the victims were African Guyanese, but there were also some Indian Guyanese, and of course, Godfrey Teixeira was definitely Portuguese, and I think there's another person called Nunes, there's a Madre, but generally speaking, the victims were residents of African villages, and you saw there were attacks at Anns Grove, the attacks at Beehive, Better for Wachting, Buxton, Golden Grove, Victoria, and those persons who know East Demerara would know you can actually move from East Bank almost by following the dams and the waterways, go all the way to West Bank Berbice without coming onto the front lands. So many people in the villages like Bedford-Wachting or Buxton were actually attacked from the rear. In fact, it was shown that the murder of the Sealy's, the murderers of the Sealy's in Buxton, had actually come from Nonpareil. And at night, the villagers in Buxton would hear the shooting in Enterprise and other villages, because these villages were sandwiched. African villages were sandwiched between Indian villages. And sometimes the terrorists used, I'm not saying the terrorists all came from Indian villages, but they used those routes to attack the villages which were unarmed. And those people who were using machine guns definitely got the machine guns from foreign communist countries. So that is really what was happening in terms of the victims of terrorism.
Lots
when
of
you look at the
stories.
roll call, you'll see that there's a predominance of names which were associated with African people.
And this leads to the third question, and it deals with the reason and maybe what was going through the minds of those PPP terrorists as they picked the villages, targeted those villages and slaughtered those people, as they did with the Sealy's. We saw as described, they're out there and witnessing the gruesome murders of those the Sealy's. I can just imagine what was going. Youngsters there as well. In 1964, we were talking about the hurricane of protest and reminding folks what the PPP did to target innocent Guyanese, innocent people. And Mr. Granger is correct. It's not, while most Guyanese were targeted, there were some Indian brothers that caught up and targeted by the PPP regime. Young Godfrey Teixeira, Portuguese were also targeted. And so it's just reminding you guys about those sad, those gruesome years under the PPP and what the PPP did to Guyanese then. And kind of like you can figure out what's happening now. The third question, President Granger, and it's important as the first two. How did certain East Demerara villages come to be targeted by the PPP GAU's terrorist campaign in 1964? It's not like they just got up one morning and just decided to kill. It had to have been uh, discussed by the PPP hierarchy, and they're going to go out and target these villages. But the question is, how did certain East Coast villages come to be targeted by the PPP's GAU terrorist campaign?
When you go back to the purpose of the hurricane of protests, to create mayhem, to make the country ungovernable, you can figure out that it was almost logical for them to target those villages. They didn't go to Anregina or Karasavai. They went to places where the violence could have the greatest impact. And 60 years ago, there was a railway running between Georgetown and Rosignol. Similarly, in West Demerara, there's one running between Purica and Wiedenhoop. So to move between Georgetown and Rosignol, you had to travel along a railway. Similarly, the roadway, Guyanese plantations, Guyanese coast is like a long ribbon between Georgetown and Brema, Georgetown and Rosignol. And people live to the north and south of that ribbon, more or less. And so to move between one village or and another, you had to pass through territory which more or less was inhabited by a predominant group. And it meant that some villages were sandwiched. For example, Buxton, although it's the Buxton Friendship, although it's maybe the largest African community on the East Coast, to the east and to the west, there are large Indian villages. So it so happened, therefore, that they were not territorial disputes, but they were obviously disputes between villages, say, in Annandale and Buxton. And because of the spatial distribution of settlements of villages along the coast, you saw villages like Anne's Grove being the scenes of violence. Annandale, which is largely, at that time, occupied by Indians, Bachelor's Adventure, Beehive, Better for Wacting, Enmore, Golden Grove, Good Hope, Lusignan, Triumph, Victoria. So villages that were targeted were villages that were the homes of the victims. And for the terrorist campaign to have an impact, it meant going to areas that were likely to respond to violence. And that's why you had this type of cycle of violence, a cycle of retaliation. And again, you also had the pattern of contamination. So once persons in one village saw their cousins and their friends and relatives in other villages, it would spread. And this is exactly what happened. The PPP campaign did have the result of spreading from one village to the other. Even though persons in another village were not attacked, they had friends and family and relatives in the villages that were attacked. So you know quite from your own experience that certain names are associated with certain villages. And when you hear the names, you know that those villages were, or those villagers were victims of attack. This is exactly what happened after the Sealeys were killed. They had relatives and friends in Wismar, and when you saw the villages being singled out, it is clear that there was a mastermind, that the weapons which were deposited, which were buried in triumph, the weapons which were used to kill the Sealis, and indicated clearly that these persons were not random, these persons were targeted. They knew that the Sealis would go to the back dam every Thursday to reproduce, to go into the market the next day, and that's exactly what happened. So they knew. These were not strangers from halfway across the country. These were from nearby villages. And I would say that that is exactly what happened. The villages were targeted in order to create mayhem, in order to create this ungovernability that the PPP aimed at. So that is the answer to your question. Certain villages were targeted because the murders there would have the greatest impact on the confusion that the PPP was trying to create. As I said, that's one of the reasons why Region 2 was almost peaceful, because killing somebody in Anansi had no impact at that time. But definitely they felt that killing somebody at Anns Grove or Buxton was going to have impact, and so it did. That is how East Demerara villages came to be targeted by the PPP in 1964.
Thank you. And good night for those to those who are now joining us, whether you're in Guyana or outside. It's Anansi Web Education. Today we examine the East Demerara murders in 1964, talking about the PPP's and GAU's terrorist campaign, where scores of persons were murdered, deliberately murdered as a political message by the PPP. Now, we want to go to the final question, President Granger, and it has to do with the British Army troops that was actually deployed in numbers, such numbers we saw in West Demerara district. And before we get to that, let's show our viewers. This is Plaisance Village, East Coast Demerara, and British Army troops and British Guyana policemen escort a man, and that was in May of 1964. They're escorting that man. They're escorting him. Well, let's get back to the final question. Why were British Army troops deployed in such numbers to the West Demerara district in 1964?
I would attribute the deployment to the energetic and offensive actions taken by Sir Richard Late. He was a World War veteran. He was a South African. He was a trained administrator. And he was a no-nonsense man, quite frankly. And from the time he came in March, 7th of March, 1964, in fact, the Legislative Council, as it was then, I think actually passed a motion against him. The PPP refused to meet him at first because he wasn't one of these laid-back British bureaucrats. He went out, he had military experience, he went out and met the villagers in West Demerara. It was who set up the sort of vigilante groups, which he later became the community policing groups. He made appeals to the people. He was very engaged. And the PPP didn't like him because he was here to enforce the British government policy to have elections in December 1964. And he was the man who did most to restore public order in the country after the mayhem of the first 3 months of the year. So he came in March at a good time, and he had such a level of credibility with the British government that he was able to call for additional British troops. We must understand that from 1953, when the PPP first got into office, up to 1966, when Guyana became independent, 13 years, there were 18 British regiments passing through Guyana. At no time, at no considerable period of time, was Guyana without British troops between 1953 and 1966. So, I mean, there was always a threat of violence by the PPP. In 1954, the statue of Queen Victoria was blown up by PPP terrorists. These are serious people. So all the disturbances you're seeing in 1964, 10 years after the sabotage and the disorder that the PPP had initiated. So the British troops were always here between 1953 and 1966. Sir Richard Late was the man who could authoritatively and credibly call on the British government to send more troops. And he went to the trouble spots. He sent the troops, first of all, to West Demerara, which could be contained because people could not easily cross the river. Those days, there was no bridge. You could cross by ferry or by bateau. But the violence on the East Coast was contained because of the British Army presence, particularly after the Governor Sir Richard Late came to the country. Similarly, when the violence skipped the Demerara River and went to East Demerara, he used the same technique. And you find the British troops were based, places like, Maikoni, the Cottage Hospital. They were based on East Coast, so they could easily be deployed to protect lives and to pursue terrorists in the East Demerara corridor. And that corridor was 34 kilometers long, roughly, between, BV and Mahaika or thereabouts. And that was an area that was patrolled by British troops. And of course, you can see from the illustration there, they were armed with the new self-loading rifles. These were not the World War II rifles that they came with in 1953. These were modern self-loading rifles. And some key regiments, with what they call the Green Jackets and light infantry regiments and the Grenadier Guards. The cream of the British Army came down here to maintain law and order, to enforce peace, what they call peacekeeping operations during this period. So the deployment in large numbers helped to restore peace. It helped to support the governor's actions in enforcing things like preventive detention and imposing curfews in certain areas once he thought it fit. And I think gradually by August, you can see the turn in terrorist activities. The GAU was forced to call off its strike in July. And the tempo, well, of course, by that time, over 32 senior members of the PPP were in preventive detention in Her Majesty's Penal Settlement at Mazaruni at Sibley Hall. And that is how peace came to be restored. So the presence of the British army was pivotal to restoring peace. And the presence of Sir Richard Late, what I call the Late factor, in having a governor who was decisively operational and not a colonial administrator. He was a man with military thinking, and he had served. And let me tell you this anecdote. He had actually served in what used to be called the Central African Federation, Northern South Rhodesia and Malawi, those three colonies. Northern Rhodesia has now become Zambia, Southern Rhodesia has become Zimbabwe, and Nyasaland has become Malawi. And I think he was a senior administrator there. And when the PPP rejected him, he actually got a letter, a testimonial from Kenneth Kaunda, testifying to the quality of his service. He later on became a vice chancellor of a university in South Africa. So he was a man of some, not only military experience, but some academic standing. And I think he had the credibility to uh, change the direction or to stop or to halt the PPP terrorism in 1964. But as far as the deployment of British troops were concerned, I think his presence was influential because he made sure that he got results out of the deployment of those troops. It wasn't just, a sideshow. It wasn't just a parade. It wasn't just a show of strength. They actually went out there and got the PPP terrorists, locked them up in Sibley Hall without trial, and restored peace to Guyana. So elections were conducted in a peaceful atmosphere on the 7th of December 1964, and we had a change in government and an end to the PPP's reign of terror.
And we're so happy that it ended with the PPP's reign of terror in 1964, and not only 1964. And we're looking at 2024 signs. The signs are still there. Terror, it is still there. All right, we dealt with the East Demerara murders in 1964, and all the questions, 4 questions answered by President David Otto Granger. You see there the weapons, PPP stronghold. This was April of 1964, and the murders of the Sealeys, right there in 1964, May of 1964. We see the British troops and the members of the British Guyana police force. They're escorting an individual probably involved, the PPP that was involved probably in the murders and other acts of terrorism. So today's program, we reflected on what happened back then. Not with any sort of big smile on our faces or anything, but to remind you of the history, the bad history of the PPP regime. Terrorist acts of terrorism in 1963-64, and probably before then as well, and after then also. President Granger, I want to thank you so much for your time as always. Anything else before we go, briefly?
Well, I would just like to thank you for giving me access to this program and to encourage our listeners to see Anansi as an educational program which would make our lives better. It is not about dry history. It's about making the country better for generations to come. It's always a pleasure to be on this program and to contribute to educating the next generation about our history and more important, about the type of country we want to grow up in.
Thank you so much again. And as always, appreciate your time. Please give our regards to Mrs. Granger.
I'll do that.
And we're still waiting to see the photographs of that kitchen garden you have. Hopefully one day soon. I'll hold you to it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and good night.
Good night to all of our listeners, whether you're in Guyana, outside of Guyana, wherever you are. Have a great rest of the night. God bless.
Mali, first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand, hold up on she frack. I wanna she grandson to the market, them a go. For their morning, the day is dawning. Forgot a crow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as